Let's talk about opacity, flow, and airbrush. Now, every time you're doing any type of paint work and you're using your brush tool, these options will be available to you. At first glance, they seem similar and they even act similar, but they're not. And in this video, I want to show you just how different they are. So first of all, let's choose our brush by pressing the B key or selecting in here on the toolbar option. At the top, we have a bunch of options. And among other things, we can choose opacity, flow, and this little icon here represents the airbrush mode. Now let's see what they are. Opacity is the master control setting. It sets the maximum amount of paint that can be painted with each stroke regardless of any other setting. Simply put, it determines how transparent your brush stroke will be. And it's referred to as the master control setting because depending on what setting you set here for opacity, these two options cannot go over that threshold. That's why it's referred to master control setting. Now let's see how that works. First of all, I have my brush tool selected and my foreground color is blue. So everything is set to 100%. And when I paint, what happens exactly is what you would expect, right? I paint with that color and it's completely opaque. There's no transparency to it. Exactly as I would expect. Now, if I were to lower my opacity to something like 20%, and if I paint now, you can see that it's not fully opaque. It's transparent to a degree, so you can see through it. Now, when I paint on this area, it won't be so visible because I'm working on a blank white background. So you won't be seeing the same effect as you would here. But I assure you, it's 20% opacity. Now let's see how it works, right? I click and I paint with 20% opacity. And I'm holding my mouse button right now in order to paint. And as long as I'm holding my mouse button, I cannot go over that 20% threshold. If I wanted to build some more color, I would have to let go of my mouse button, click again, and paint over the same area. When I do, I also can go over 20%, but because I'm painting on an area that's already painted with 20%, it adds 20% plus 20% to create density of about 40%. And if I were to now draw a line over this painted area, and you would see that on the blank background, it added 20%. When it got to this area, it added 20% on top of 20%. And here it added another 20% on top of 20 and 20%. So that's the only way you can build color density when using your opacity. You have to paint over the same area. And you have to let go of your mouse in order to paint. You can't just go over the same area while holding down your mouse and expect the paint to be more dense. That's something that's unique to opacity. Now, flow and airbrush mode, they work just a bit differently. What they do is they build color based on movement in case of flow and based on time in case of airbrush mode. So let's see how that works. I'm going to lower my opacity and I'm going to lower the flow value to what opacity was, and that will be 20%. So if I paint now, remember, flow sets the amount of paint applied to an area every time the brush moves. Now, something that's not written here is that every time the brush moves over a certain area that we already have painted, that's where you see the effect of actual color buildup. And if I click, I started with 20%, but as you can see, when I go over the same area, I can quickly build to the opacity value. In this case, that's 100%. Now, in case you're wondering why is this weird pattern here, well, in order for me to show it to you, I'm going to have to open my brush panel. And in the brush tip shape section for options, I can see that my spacing option is set to 20%. And spacing option determines the spacing between the dots which are used to make up this line of color. In order to demonstrate this more visually, take a look at the preview down here when I increase the spacing slider. You start to see those individual dots. Now when it's at 20%, I think it was at 20%, they're so close to one another, but they're not. They still have some spacing between them, and that's why you see this pattern. And if I were to now zoom, you can actually see the individual lines, and based on the spacing option of 20%, that's how far apart were they from one another. And if I go back to my smoothing option, what I'm going to do now is lower it to 1%. I can't go lower than that. And I'm going to paint again. And when I paint, what's going to happen is that it will appear like I'm not applying this flow of 20%, like everything is set to 100%. Take a look. And in case you're wondering why is that so, well, now the spacing option is set to 1%, so those individual dots are so close to one another that basically they overlap one another to the point that every time the one overlaps the other, they build color all the way to 100%, because that's the setting for the opacity at the moment. And if I were to increase the spacing option to something like this, 145%, now we can clearly see the individual dots, and there is some definite spacing between them. And if I were to paint right now, you would clearly see the effect, and it would be better for illustrative purposes. But this is not something you might use on an image. I just wanted to show you now here for demonstration purposes. So take a look. When I click, it added 20%. And when I paint, I'm still painting with 20%. Now, it don't have the same effect as I did before, because now the individual dots are quite spaced. There's quite a bit of space between them. So if I were to paint, now watch what happens when I go over this same dot. I start to build another 20%, similar to opacity, but only time I don't have to let go of my mouse to do so. That's the key difference. So all I have to do is now paint more time over the same area, and I will build the color all the way to 100%, which is in this case the default value for opacity. And that is how flow works. So it builds the color density based on the movement of your brush. If you move your mouse over the same area, it builds up more color. I will now increase my flow and my opacity to 100%. And for this next option of airbrushing, I will change some settings back here. I'm going to set my hardness to 0%. I could have lowered this to actually 1%. There's really no difference. As for the size, I'm going to increase my brush to 35 pixels. Maybe some more. How about 60 pixels? Alright, now let me show you. So at this point, opacity flow is set to 100% and the airbrush mode is currently off. Airbrushing allows you to build up color density based on the time you spend on one particular place. And unlike flow, which works on movement, airbrush works on time. Let me show you. At this point, it's off, opacity flow 100%. I click and I'm making a dot. But I'm still holding my mouse button, but nothing happens. The dot is not growing any larger. And also, it's painted from 0 to 100%. That's because the opacity is set to 100%. And I will explain exactly what that means in a minute. So for right now, all you need to know that once I click, I'm making a dot and it's not growing. But watch what happens when I activate the airbrush mode. The longer time I spend on the same dot, on the same place, the more color density I will build up. It's pretty much similar to spilling an ink on a paper, and then paper starts to soak in the ink. So the place where you drop the ink starts to grow as the more color or more ink is being absorbed by the paper. Pretty much similar effect here. So watch what happens. I'm going to click and hold. And you can definitely see how now that dot is actually growing. It's even growing now. And that's because of the airbrush mode. It works based on time. If I spend more time on one place, I add more color density. Now let me show you. If I go back in history, I have a clean slate, and now I want to show you how exactly all of these settings work. So opacity, flow, and airbrush mode, how they work all together. I've explained them individually, and now I'm going to show you how they work together. And for this, I'm going to change again some of the settings, primarily to give you better illustrative idea of how this works. So let's set this to 145%. I'm going to lower my size a bit, and now I can collapse this palette, and I'm going to change some settings here. For better demonstration purposes, I'm going to set my opacity to 50%. I'm going to set flow to 10%, like so, and I'm going to turn on the airbrush mode. And first, before I even begin to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen so you can follow up better. For opacity is set to 50%, which means that no matter how many times I go over an area or how many time I spend on one area, the effect is not going to be built up beyond 50%. Remember, that's the master control setting. So opacity sets the limit of these two options. Now, flow works by adding density color based on movement over the same area, and airbrush mode adds color based on the time spent on one area. So when I click and I hold, it's going to start at 10%, that's the flow value. It's going to use the airbrush mode, and the longer time I spend on one place, it's going to build up color, 10% plus 10% plus 10%, all the way to the limit, which is 50% in this case. And when I start going over another area, when I start to move my brush, the airbrush mode won't, because I'm not going to spend time on one place, airbrush mode won't have the opportunity to build color. And I'm going to paint with 10% because that's the flow value. Now, each time I go over the same area, and if I do it really quickly, I'm going to use just the flow mode. Airbrush mode, again, doesn't have the time to react, so flow adds 10% plus 10% plus 10% all the way to 50%. And when I stop and I again spend more time on one place, then the airbrush mode will begin to work, and it will incrementally 10% plus 10% add more color density all the way to 50%. Okay, now if you have problem following that, let me show you. I start, and it starts with 10%. That's the flow value. It uses the airbrush mode now to build the color 10 plus 10 plus 10 all the way to 50%. And when I go over an area, I'm not spending time, so it's using flow value 10%. When I go over the same area, it uses the flow ability to build up color based on my brush movement over the same area. And when I stop, I'm going to activate the airbrush mode again, and it's going to build up all the way to the limit for my opacity, which is 50%. All right, now let's see how that works. Once again, more history travel. All right, so I click 10%. I'm spending time on one place. Airbrush mode builds 10 plus 10 plus 10 to 50. Then I move over the same area. Because I'm moving, this doesn't work anymore, so flow is painting with 10%. When I go over the same brush strokes, 10% plus 10% keeps adding until it hits the limit of 50%. And if I stop and spend time on one place, the airbrush mode starts to kick in again, 10 plus 10 until it hits 50%. That's how they work together. So let me show you. I click and I hold. Starts at 10%, builds up to 50% based on airbrush mode. I paint over this area, nothing happens because I'm painting with 10% for flow. So as I start going over the same area, flow builds up color. The more time I go over the same area, the more color it builds up until I stop and spend more time on one place. Then the airbrush mode starts to kick in and it builds it up to opacity, which is 50%. And that is how opacity, flow, and airbrush mode work together when using brush tool. Now, once again, if you wanted to use this on an actual image and you wanted to take advantage of this, chances are you won't be using the settings for where's my panel? Settings for spacing options and hardness and all that, so you won't be able to see much of this effect. And it's really hard to understand the mechanics behind them, so people just tend to use what they understand, and that is usually opacity and sometimes the airbrush mode. But rarely do they figure out how exactly does the flow work. And in this video, I wanted to give you a definitive illustration of just what's the difference between those three settings.